Empathy of Jesus. And this evening, this practical application is summarized like this in empathy. It is called biblical fellow feeling. Fix this. Biblical fellow feeling at the bottom right-hand corner of the little chart there, and it gives you a little journey of what this element of sympathy looks like. And we bear one another's burdens and we so fulfill the law of Christ. This grows out of having one mind, a mutual understanding, this peace. And then we find ourselves being moved with compassion. And empathy brings about this gentleness or this kindness. And as we truly exemplified, what practical empathy is weeping with those that weep. And in studying the empathy of Jesus, our objective was to learn how to feel. Because empathy is an incredible thing that occurs in the life of humankind, and it just confirms that we're created in the image of God. And compassion and empathy are consistent with everything that Jesus instructs us and guides us, as we saw this morning. But as we got to the end of the lesson, we talked a little bit about boundaries. Because if you recall, in Matthew the 14th chapter, Jesus fed the 5,000. It's also recorded in Mark and John. In John's account, though, when they came back the next day, Jesus refused to feed the 5,000. So, while Jesus demonstrates perfect compassion, he also understood that the act of giving, in this case, would be counterproductive to what his objective was into creating that social order. In other words, he was teaching them, but he was teaching them not how to come and ask for another meal. He was teaching them how to be responsible and provide for their meals and to have this work ethic and to import this social order that wouldn't require the destitute, because each one would be looking out one for the other. And for those that are visiting, John 17, 20 and 21 is a mantra of ours as a church that belongs to Christ. And that simply is that we seek to answer the prayer of Jesus. And if you're interested in doing that, then we hope and pray you'll consider this a place to be a family. Neither did Jesus pray for his apostles and prophets alone, but for us. Those who would believe in him through their word, that we would all be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they all may be one in us, that the world might believe that you sent me. And that unity looks like that social order that Jesus established. And then something happens. And the state of the church that oftentimes is supposed to be there to be the care and the support. I have many people that I encounter and I talk to, they don't want to have anything to do with the church because the church, and they're referring to a congregation as something that happened and it went bad. And so now it's blocked. In their circumstance, something happened in which there was first listening and compassion. And then, without boundaries, somehow they were manipulated, enabled, disrespected, had a codependency that if they had to no longer have themselves, and I'm going to make this point in a little bit, on how you maintain your identity, specifically, individually, while maintaining your harmony and working within a family relationship. And that's the only way that it'll ever work. And when toxic elements come into that empathy is when that empathy is couched in relationship isolation. And suddenly there is the loss of boundaries. In toxic empathy, we want to look at the emotional presence that avoids that detachment. That is for us, and then also to have the insightfulness. We don't want to do this, and we can easily be guilty, and we don't want it to happen to us, and we can easily be victim. And that's why the boundaries have to be understood as we kind of navigate through some really terrible texts in this scripture. Galatians 6 tells us to carry one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. But he doesn't tell us to carry the weight of the world individually. In fact, Galatians 6 is incumbent upon us to share in one another's burdens. Share in one another's burdens. Mine with you and yours with mine. And that's where we always must see empathy that is Christ-like, is not one-sided. But toxic empathy, very emotional, very deceptive, and very destructive to everyone. It's relationships that bring emotional emptiness rather than fulfillment. In other words, there's the effort to build the relationship, but for some reason there is nothing embodied in the relationship. And there's a reason for that. And we have to be aware of those things so that we don't do the very thing that Jesus warned about. And that is that we would take that which is sacred in our lives, set it before an entity that would rend it or devour it. And in so doing, take your compassion, take your empathy. Now you don't know how to feel. And all because you were seeking to do that empathy work, giving that Jesus designed, but something got twisted. And instead of it building up mutually, somehow you got broke down. Relationships that are, I should put, emotionally controlled by one seeking self-fulfillment. When one individual is like the winner. Because in the realm of empathy of Christ, there are no losers and winners. Everyone wins, and everyone's needs are met. It is pictured even in a cultural setting in Acts the 2nd chapter, in Acts the 4th chapter, in Acts the 6th chapter, where that when there were compassionate needs that were there, they were met. So how do things go wrong? First of all, in Judges 16, we want to look at one of the dark sides of the stories of historical literature in the Scriptures that tell us of Samson and Delilah. And he, as a Nazirite, had not cut his hair. His strength was hidden in that secret. It was a unique thing in that time for him. And he kept it secret as he was commanded to do. And yet he entered into a relationship and he got very involved with one named Delilah. And on a repeated basis, he was so given to her in his compassion that he just apparently made himself completely vulnerable, manipulatable, and then ultimately accepting betrayal. And listen to how it occurred. Verse 15. When she said to him, "How can you say that you love me when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have told me where your great strength lies, and have not told me where your great strength lies." And it came to pass that when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him, that his soul was vexed to death, and that he told her all his heart. And he said to her, "No razor that ever come on the head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. And if I am shaven, my strength will leave me, and I shall become as the strength of another man." All of that because he thought he could empathetically respond to one that he was so compassionate for, and it would bring him desirable peace. And that's when that compromise occurs even in our own lives. Out of a desire for a relationship so bad that we compromise the principles of truth, and then the end result is we're consumed. And when we put ourselves out there without those barriers, then manipulation, exploitation can be expected. You begin to experience, like in his case, he was sick to death. He was to the point, whatever I have to do to make it right, to make it well, when there was nothing that he could do to make it right, to make it well. And this exploitation of this secret of his. The secret of his suddenly was exploited among everyone, and it led to his destruction. And all that based upon the profitability of manipulation. So what you have in that depiction is the warning. You have the fatal compromise. And this is how empathy, this toxic empathy, processes to compromise principles. He yielded to her relentless emotional pressure. Remember how she said it, "How can you say you love me if you don't do this?" That's a tactic. We don't have to do any of those things in love, in that process. We don't earn and merit it in that relationship. Allowed her pleas to control his judgment. She became in control. And in that, his inner strength, remember, he was worried, it just wore him out. So his inner strength got compromised because he continuously engaged in her toxicity. And then betrayal. The toxic yielding part. So you have toxic empathy. You have to see the yielding part. We can experience toxic empathy, but don't let empathy become your vulnerability, your weakness. Do not allow human approval over divine purpose. And this is what happens so many times in relationships in which they become scarred. See, it was that short-term gratification that led to his demise. He just gave in to the demands. Lost his eyesight, lost his freedom, became a spectacle to his enemies. His legacy was defined by a tragic loss, even though he was the strongest man to ever live, and a painful lesson on boundaries. Samson and Delilah. Toxic empathy allows another's desires to override our core values and true strength. Like Samson's vow, requires resisting emotional pressure and compromising our integrity, the compromise leads to loss. Compromise doesn't lead to peace. Compromise leads to loss when we're talking about the divine will of God, core values. You can't do that. And then in 1 Kings 3, and the tale of two mothers. Marked it and lost it. After Solomon had requested wisdom, the two mothers that came before him, let me just share it with you, beginning. In verse 16, the two women who were harlots came to the king, stood before him. One woman said, "O Lord, this woman that I dwell in the same house, I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened on the third day after I had given birth that this woman also gave birth. We were together. No one was with us in the house except the two of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night, and she took the son from my side while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I arose in the morning to nurse my son, he was dead. But when I examined him in the morning, indeed it was not my son whom I had born." And the other woman said, "No, but the living one is mine, and the dead one is yours." And the woman said, "No, but the dead son is yours, and the living one is mine." And they spoke before the king, and the king said, "Bring me a sword." Verse 24, and they brought a sword to the king, and he simply prepared to divide. And the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, and she yearned and said, with compassion, "O my Lord, give her the living child." Stop there for a minute. Because in this emotional dynamic, we have a very realistic moment in which this case had been presented and all the evidence was there, but the judgment hadn't been declared. But the one that had the power was ready to cut the child in half. Toxic empathy is not a small thing. And when you begin to think of the effects that we see in our culture from this kind of thing, then we understand why we are in such difficult grips in our families. Sometimes individuals may see control and ownership rather than friendship and help. Obsession can cause parents to perceive a child as an extension of themselves. Children are not considered an extension of their parents. They're an individual that is viewed as an individual gift from God. And that's a gift to humanity that came through you and through your life. And yet we have the perceptions that pride, somehow in that insecurity, is protection. And the protection leads to isolation. And the isolation there's nothing left. And all of this for reputation management. When you want to consider how dark toxic empathy is, generally it will be over one thing. That is the effort to try to control the thought of someone else about the self. Bringing the case public rather than embracing the loss or normalcy. She brought public opinion in an effort to validate her false identity. Her social standing had priority over the child's best interest. A woman was willing to divide the child. The compassionate one, the real mother, would not let the child be divided. The kind of love that we're talking about is that we have a culture that there's some sort of denied access. And that goes for almost any and every organization and group. Because if we do not begin to develop dialogue, then we can never move forward. But we still live in this where individuals who have the ability or are in the position seek to isolate, to take away the access of things that would otherwise be healthy, strengthening, and encouraging. So somehow the listening and the compassion, that short step was simply when the compassion turned into something that was for me. Not what I could give, but what I could get. When we consider Acts 20:35, and he says that, remember the words of our Lord Jesus, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Now, that blessing is at the core of empathy. To establish the biblical boundaries in difficult relationships, pray for wisdom. Seek clear lines of communication. Because in toxic relationships, to put a barrier up from those, you have to have difficult communication. And I do like the fact that Galatians 5 said, make a difference between a load and a burden. Some people carry heavy loads, and we do that. And we are to pick up our weight and carry our own weight, is what he's saying. And then you have to predetermine limits. Maintain that personal peace and integrity. And then begin to seek support. Because in every case, every compassionate individual that has encountered that toxicity has been faced with one of those choices that they did not want to make themselves. The woman that stood before the king and gave up her child, loved that child so much that she would give the child up to save its life. And we have others that would say, if I can't have it, nobody can have it. It's about mutual respect, empathy with self-care, and see things as empowerment, not rescue. Because an individual who has turned their back on righteousness and God and truth, you cannot rescue until they turn with the Word. And so, finally, making this wisdom in regard to the giving, So the principles of stewardship, because when we talk about empathy, we're just talking about our emotional inventory and how we manage it. You can't give it all away. You'll have none left. And there is composure in that. Jesus demonstrated it. There were times after many pressing days that he would go away and be away by himself to pray. But the principles are always be a cheerful giver, not out of compulsion. You don't have to do this. And there's no comeback. There's no payback when we give in that respect. And then, of course, as Philippians 1, seek wisdom, discernment, knowledge. The toxic warning is, know this: whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse. That's what he's talking about. It's great when we can have communication and grow in communication. If you correct a scoffer that's scoffing, guess what? You're going to get hit back. He who reproves a wicked man will incur injury. A wicked person, they don't want to hear about empathy. They don't want to hear about, especially about toxic empathy. But godliness with contentment. And maybe if we were going to find the cure, it's finding this place of contentment and how much we gain from that. Having food and clothing, with these be content, but godliness with contentment is great gain. Realized in this way. Empathy versus giving. And this is how we want to really end our lives and live our lives, okay? And having that balance. As the Good Samaritan in his empathy took in the man that had fallen among thieves, he didn't give away all his livelihood that he could no longer function in business because of his empathy. And that would be toxic empathy. It would not have a desired result other than a temporary one. But this empathy, this internal feeling, has to be processed, understood, and then you share emotionally, providing emotional supports and receiving emotional supports, bearing one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Each one must carry his own load. You see how that works? Each one must carry his own load, bear one another's burdens, carry your own weight, but the external act, it's the act of service and generosity and physical help. And that's what we see in compassion. And that's how we find the social order of Jesus and how that we process toxic empathy, realizing the end result and the devastation of it. Terry, you got a song for it. We have a song that we're going to sing, number 845. It's in your songbook. If you are subject to the invitation and desire to respond, be buried in the